There you are. Come in, take a seat. Don't want to be starting the show without you. Kevin Fernihough, fan this side of 12. Here's one to check out there. Let me know what you think. Separating the man or artist from their music. Something we're going to be discussing over the course of the next 3 hours. Separating the man or artist from their music. At what point would you refuse to listen to the music of an artist based on their behaviour? You may have spotted in the news in the last couple of days the BBC has been criticised for mentioning Rolf Harris as one of the artists that the late George Martin worked with, despite it being true. Begs a question, doesn't it? Should artists and indeed their work be airbrushed from history? Rolf Harris is one example. Then, of course, there's Gary Glitter, the rock band Lost Prophets, their lead singer Ian Watkins, who is in prison for the sexual assault of a child. All of these artists were incredibly popular at the height of their careers. But would you listen to their records? Would you listen to their music now? We can, of course, broaden this one out. There were several allegations directed at Michael Jackson during his career, but his music is still as popular as ever. Elvis Costello had to apologise for the use of racist language in the past. Rapper Chris Brown assaulted then-girlfriend Rihanna. The list, it just goes on and on and on. So at what point do you throw out albums and records? You've got my number, get in touch.
Call us now.
0345 305 1122.
BBC
Crowd pleaser written right across it, yeah. Morning, how you doing? We made it back from the weekend then. Kevin Fernihough, fan for BBC Radio Cumbria. Here putting another 3-hour block on your daily workload. Well, that's the plan this side of 12. Written for and featuring in the 1985 blockbuster movie Back to the Future. Huey Lewis in the news and the power of love. Be a part of Cumbria's biggest mid-morning conversation. Fan this side of 12. If you'd like to text me, it's Cumbria 81333. Text, of course, charged at your standard message rate. If you're following the show, a listener online, you can always email with any comments as to the guests we're speaking to during the course of this morning's show. fern.cumbria@bbc.co.uk. Members of the team amassing the other side of the glass there. If you'd like to pick up the phone, have a word, feel free to do so. 0345 305 1122. So, Leader of the Gang by Gary Glitter, Two Little Boys, Rolf Harris. Popular in their day, but would you listen to their records now in 2016? Just so as you know, in preparing for this morning's show, we asked the editorial team here at the BBC whether we could illustrate some of the artists mentioned with a montage of music. However, we were advised by bosses at the BBC not to. The BBC, of course, recently criticised for mentioning Rolf Harris as one of the artists that the late George Martin worked with. But should artists and indeed their work be airbrushed from history? It's a question we posed this morning. Looking forward to hearing from you. At what point would you choose to throw out albums, CDs, recordings of certain artists? Music journalist Mark Beech joining me on the show this morning. Hi there, Mark.
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
Some of the artists that I've mentioned today, the likes of Gary Glitter, Rolf Harris, we've also mentioned Ian Watkins from the Lost Prophets. Incredibly serious crimes that they committed.
Yeah.
But should that take away from their artistic merit or their cultural significance in regards to their music?
It's a very good question. I think we ought to make the point. This is a very heavy subject for 9 o'clock and on Monday morning, but it'll be interesting to see how people respond to it. But my answer would be to say that each case is different to a certain degree. I mean, some of the people we've talked of there have been accused of things. There are some others we could name who have been, convicted, some not. Some are dead, some are alive. They're all different offences. And, I think the bottom line I would give is that nothing, could possibly excuse criminal behaviour. If someone's done something wrong, they've lied, they've done some of the things that these people are being convicted of. You can't possibly say this is ever right. And, and I would not come on as an apologist saying that, that could possibly be the case. I remember having a conversation once with John Squire of the Stone Roses, and he was asking a question about Phil Spector. It was like a question I gather he's asked a fair few people. Phil Spector, the US producer, you'll know, has made some great records, some of the greatest records of the 60s. And then later in life he was convicted over a killing of a woman at his home. And John's point was basically the same thing as you're asking, is like, would it have been better for the world if Phil had never been around at all, as it were? And, you can argue this both ways. You can say, well, obviously we wouldn't have had Be My Baby, we wouldn't have those magnificent records, but probably then one woman would still be alive, and Phil Spector wouldn't be in prison for the rest of his days, potentially. So it's a hard one. I would say that I absolutely adore those Phil Spector records, but nothing can take away from the fact that, ultimately he did a criminal act and ended up this way. Would I still listen to Phil Spector records? Yes, personally, I would. I've got sufficient detachment to be able to say that I would. I wouldn't throw them out because of that. But, there'll be people who have, and I've reported on cases of when the Gary Glitter came on through, who, people therefore discarded all of their Gary Glitter and Glitter Band records just because of what had happened many years later. And I really respect them from their point of view. It's HMV and other shops took all the records of Gary Glitter off the shelves for some time. And you do listen to them, and it's different now, because Gary Glitter, for example, did, again, it was a cover of a Motown song, and it had been around for a long time anyway. And I was listening to some of those, Be My Baby and things like that, and actually one of Phil Spector's tracks, which then went on to greater things. But in the Gary Glitter version, anyway, you listen to it, and it now has a certain resonance. It sounds different. People didn't think of this at the time, Be My Baby, and after he was convicted of all this stuff, it's almost unlistenable to, you know what I mean?
I suppose it comes down to a point that you raised. It's separating the individual, the artist, from their music. It's going to be interesting to hear from listeners to BBC Radio Cumbria. Again, my number 0345 305 1122. If you'd like to comment, texting the show, Cumbria 81333. Mark, another point to raise here. Do you think it was right that the BBC was criticised for including Rolf Harris in a list of artists the late producer George Martin worked with?
Rolf Harris is again a different case. I don't think it was. No, I mean, it is a statement of fact that one of the many things that George Martin did in a great and glorious career was to produce comedy records and things, and one of the many artists was Rolf Harris. I don't find it particularly egregious that it should be mentioned. It wouldn't be something you would dwell on, because certainly it's not one of the great highlights of George Martin's career. But as a passing mention, I don't see it as a problem at all.
Okay. Just moving this conversation forward, and again, hopefully listeners to BBC Radio Cumbria will get on board with their thoughts and views. Obviously, the more serious crimes they do, rightfully so, end careers. But some artists, they have, let's face it, recovered. I'll give you some examples here. Michael Jackson, allegations of sexual activity with children. Elvis Costello had to apologise for the use of racist language some years back. Chris Brown assaulted ex-girlfriend Rihanna. The Rolling Stones had property raided for drugs. The list, it goes on and on and on. Why do you think their careers or their legacy have remained largely unaffected?
Well, again, I suppose it goes back to the point I made earlier on. There are all different sorts of things you can be accused of. Some are more serious than others. There certainly will be fans, and I'm not necessarily saying that I would agree with them, who would say that, ultimately you put that on one side, you'd weigh up the seriousness of the allegations being made and the greatness of the music. And if you think that the music is great and it's moved you in a big way and it's been popular and it's been critically acclaimed, then you can't totally take that away from it, the fans would say, and I can see the point that could be made there. But so many different cases, like Michael Jackson, he falls off the abuse allegations against him, and that was okay, and there would be people who would say that they were convinced by that. He's no longer around, so we can be a bit more free in what we say about Michael Jackson and some of the others. But nonetheless, then you could take that on one side, and at the time he died, I remember writing an obituary on Michael Jackson. I said, well, yes, on the minus side, there are all these things which have been said against Michael Jackson. On the plus side, you still have a great record like, Billie Jean, which is one of the greatest records of its time. You put it on and listen to it. And actually, you could probably find in the lyrics some things which now have become rather more interesting with those abuse allegations about the lie becoming the truth and things like that. And you think, that's an interesting little irony that's in the lyric there like that. But with all of these artists, where they've been accused and found to be guilty, then I would have to say that, if you're the relative of one of the people concerned, or you're one of the people concerned, you won't care what someone's music's like, whether it's good or bad or indifferent. That doesn't take away the crime and the hurt that came to you.
Interesting you mentioned the use of lyrics. Just in closing here, as we broaden this music issue even further, lyrics that include racist phrases. A BBC DJ was sacked for playing The Sun Has Got Its Hat On, which includes the N-word. There were calls to ban Tom Jones' Delilah from the start of Wales matches because the song, some might argue, trivialises violence against women. Music from a bygone era, arguably, but again, surely there is a cultural significance. What would you say?
Well, this comes on to, I suppose, the issue of what you regard as being politically correct and stuff. And there have been some very interesting articles in the last few days where it's been suggested that things are starting to go too far. And I would be in some agreement with that. Obviously, then, you have to be aware of the cultural significance of the times and a bit more aware of the fact that something can be said which isn't necessarily going to be seen the same way now as when Tom was recording that song, to the way things would be seen, way back in the 60s and stuff like that. So some sense of, cultural context you have to take into account as well.
I think there's going to be plenty in the way of conversation to come over the course of Monday's mid-morning show. Mark, thank you for joining us here on BBC Radio Cumbria. Music journalist Mark Beech